Hi. So another really common problem I come across when dialogue editing is a thing called plosives. I don't know why I said it like that. Plosives are the thing that happens when your mouth forms the p, t, d, k type noises, and you're basically forcing air into the microphone at such a rapid rate it makes a really sort of boomy noise. I made a really terrible mistake, schoolboy error, the other week, not getting someone to use a pop filter properly when they were recording their podcast intro, and I'm just fixing it right now. So let me show you this. Okay, so listen to this and you'll hear what I mean.
On this podcast.
You hear that, right? The word podcast. There's a really loud boom.
On this podcast.
And that's what we want to get rid of, because that right the way through a podcast, that could be really annoying. I use this bit of software called Isotope RX, which allows me to see all the different frequencies of a bit of audio, and I can tell on this one that if I start to highlight it a bit for you, this big yellow shiny bit down here is the problem. That's where the plosive is, and that's what's giving me that sort of boomy sound. So there are lots of different ways to tackle that. You can be quite surgical with it, you can be quite automatic with it, and try and filter it out. So for example, I can just select that bit in particular, by doing that, and it'll find those frequencies that are particularly bad, and then I can treat them. We could do that as an instant sort of process where I can say, well, let's just take that bit, and the software has taken those frequencies and reduced them. So you can now hear.
On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast.
So it got rid of the boom, but I feel that's awful weak. It's made the signal really weak. So there's no low end to it. There's no punch to it at all. So let's go back to how it was. And start again.
On this podcast.
So there's a great tool in here called Deplosive, which if you use the settings right can be really effective for it. So let's bring that up. Deplosive. There are lots of presets I could choose from, and it tries to automatically detect what you're doing, but sometimes you just have to be a bit more surgical than that. So if I highlight the area that I want to edit out this plosive from, I will start playing it back, and I'll turn up the sensitivity until we hear the software pick up the booming noise and get rid of it for me. So we'll just whack the strength right up, and we'll start to preview it.
On this podcast, we're going to. On this.
Okay, so it's still there.
We're going to. On this podcast.
If I adjust the sensitivity,
we're going to. On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast.
And actually, remarkably, that hardly took anything at all. 0.2 of the sensitivity just to pick up on that and get rid of it, but it's not losing that low end that sort of makes it sound weak. So as not to process it too much, I'll start to turn the strength down so that it's only just taking out what I need. So let's try that again.
On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast,
he's gradually getting rid of it.
We're going to. On this podcast, 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 we're going to. On this podcast.
Okay, that didn't sound too bad. I think I might just turn it up a little bit more.
On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast, we're going to. On this podcast, we're.
Okay, I think I'm happy with that, so I'm going to hit the render button. And if I now play that back.
On this podcast, we're going to explore health.
So you would barely know that had happened now. And so by being surgical with it, it means that it's not over-treating it, it's not over-processing it, and you would never know that it had been edited. So yes, I will go through and get rid of all the other p, t, k, and b, and d things that happened, seeing as I made such an error in not treating them in the first place. Okay, thank you. See you tomorrow.